The desert grows cold after midnight. Most people never learn this about Egypt. How the temperature drops once the sun disappears. How the wind carries a chill that settles deep into stone and bone alike. On the Giza Plateau, when the last tour buses have departed and the vendors have packed away their wares, a different world emerges. The floodlights dim, the voices fade, and in the silence that follows, the pyramids become something else entirely. They stand against the stars as they have for thousands of years, their limestone faces pale under the moon, their shadows stretching across sand that remembers footsteps from ages we cannot name. There is a weight to this silence, a density that presses against the chest of anyone who has ever stood alone in their presence after dark. These are not tourist attractions in such moments. They are witnesses. They are keepers of something we have spent centuries trying to understand and have barely begun to grasp. Somewhere beneath this plateau, there are chambers that no living person has ever entered. Passages sealed so long ago that even the memory of their purpose has been lost. Modern scanning technology has detected voids within the Great Pyramid that remain unexplored, spaces that have held their darkness for millennia, waiting. What secrets rest in that darkness is a question that has haunted researchers since the first European scholars arrived here, with their measuring instruments and their certainties. Most of those certainties did not survive the encounter. Tonight, let yourself settle into this mystery. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the noise of the ordinary world fall away. What follows is not a collection of wild theories or breathless conspiracies. It is something quieter than that, and perhaps more unsettling. It is a journey through questions that serious people have asked. Questions that remain unanswered despite 2 centuries of excavation and study. Questions about time itself, about what came before the civilization we call ancient Egypt, about whether these monuments might remember a world that existed long before the pharaohs claimed them as their own. We have all learned the story. The Great Pyramid was built around 2500 BCE as a tomb for a king named Khufu. The Sphinx was carved from bedrock during the reign of his successor. Workers spent 20 years moving millions of stone blocks using copper tools and human determination. The story is neat. The story is logical. The story has only one problem, and it is a problem that has grown more troubling with each passing decade of investigation. The evidence does not entirely agree, but before we can examine what the stones themselves reveal, we must first travel back to the moment when the modern world rediscovered these monuments and began asking questions that would prove far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. In the summer of 1798, a fleet of French ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying an unusual cargo. Napoleon Bonaparte had brought soldiers, certainly, nearly 40,000 of them. But he had also brought something unprecedented in military history, an army of scholars. 167 scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and artists accompanied the campaign, tasked with documenting everything they encountered in this ancient land. They called themselves the savants, and they had no idea what they were about to find. When these men of science first stood before the Great Pyramid, their instruments seemed almost foolish in their hands. Nothing in their education had prepared them for this. The structure rose nearly 500 feet into the Egyptian sky, covering 13 acres of ground. Assembled from blocks of stone so precisely fitted that a knife blade could not slip between them. They began measuring, calculating, recording, and slowly the numbers began to disturb them. The base of the pyramid was level 2 within a fraction of an inch across its entire massive footprint. The corners were aligned to true north with an accuracy that surpassed most contemporary European observatories. The ratios between the pyramid's dimensions encoded mathematical constants that these scholars recognized immediately but could not explain. Napoleon himself grew fascinated with the monument. According to accounts that have survived in various forms, the young general requested a night alone inside the king's chamber, that granite room buried deep within the pyramid's heart. His officers waited outside through the dark hours. When Napoleon finally emerged at dawn, something had changed. Those who witnessed his exit described a man visibly shaken, pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. An aide asked what had happened in that sealed chamber. Napoleon's response, according to legend, was barely a whisper. He said that no one would ever believe him. He refused to discuss it for the rest of his life, and on his deathbed, when someone raised the subject one final time, he began to speak, then stopped himself, shaking his head. Whatever he experienced inside the pyramid, he carried it into his grave. Perhaps this story is merely legend, embellished by time, but it captures something true about the pyramid's effect on those who study it closely. Certainty has a way of crumbling inside those ancient corridors. The scholars Napoleon brought to Egypt would eventually produce a masterwork called the Description de l'Egypte, a comprehensive survey that launched the modern science of Egyptology. But from its very beginning, that science carried an uncomfortable inheritance. Many early researchers approached Egypt not with open questions but with predetermined answers, seeking to confirm biblical chronologies rather than discover independent truths. The official story that would emerge over the next 2 centuries was shaped by these early assumptions. And like all official stories, it would eventually face evidence that refused to cooperate with the narrative already written. Asterisk, the timeline we all learned in school goes something like this. Around 2,500 years before the Common Era, a pharaoh named Khufu commanded the construction of the greatest building the ancient world would ever produce. His workers quarried limestone from the plateau itself and granite from Aswan, 500 miles to the south, using copper tools, wooden sledges, and ramps of mud brick. They moved approximately 2.3 million blocks of stone into position over roughly 2 decades. The Sphinx was carved shortly after, during the reign of Khufu's son Khafre, its lion body and human face gazing eternally toward the rising sun. This is the orthodox account, and it is supported by genuine evidence. Workers discovered cartouches bearing Khufu's name painted in red ochre within the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Spaces that were never meant to be seen after construction was complete. Papyrus documents unearthed at Wadi al-Jarf describe work gangs and supply logistics, providing administrative details that match the expected timeline. The evolution of pyramid design from the early stepped structures to the latest sited monuments suggests a learning curve, a civilization developing its techniques through trial and error over generations. To dismiss this evidence would be dishonest. It exists, and it tells a coherent story. Yet coherence is not the same as completeness. Within this official narrative, certain questions linger at the edges. Politely ignored in most textbooks, but persistently troubling to those who look closely. The cartouches were found in chambers sealed away from all eyes. Could they have been placed there not by builders but by later rulers claiming monuments that already stood? The papyri describe the movement of materials, the organization of labor, the logistics of feeding workers. What they do not describe, curiously, is how. How were 80-ton granite beams lifted 200 feet and positioned with millimeter accuracy? The documents are silent on this point. And then there is the question of evolution itself. Pyramid construction in Egypt spans only a few generations at its peak. Before this period, nothing approaching this sophistication existed. After it, quality declined dramatically, many of which have collapsed into rubble, while the earlier structures stand virtually pristine. This is the opposite of what a learning curve should produce. The mainstream narrative is not wrong, but it may be incomplete, like a puzzle assembled with pieces from different boxes. The picture it produces makes sense only if you do not examine the edges too closely. Fortunately, certain researchers have dedicated their careers to examining precisely those edges, and what they found in the stone itself would challenge everything the textbooks claimed to have settled. Robert Schoch did not travel to Egypt searching for mysteries. He went to solve one, and then returned to his comfortable academic life at Boston University, where his expertise in stratigraphy and paleontology had earned him respect among colleagues who valued careful, conventional science. When independent researcher John Anthony West approached him in 1990 with a strange request, Schoch was skeptical. West believed the Sphinx was far older than Egyptologists claimed, and he needed a geologist to examine the evidence. Schoch agreed, expecting to quickly debunk the theory and move on. He had no way of knowing that what he would find in the bedrock of Giza would follow him for the rest of his career. The Sphinx sits in a rectangular enclosure, a trench carved from the limestone plateau from which the monument itself was shaped. Most visitors focus on the statue, that enigmatic figure with its eroded face gazing toward the eastern horizon. Schoch focused instead on the walls surrounding it, the vertical surfaces of bedrock that had been exposed when ancient workers excavated the stone. What he saw there stopped him cold. The walls were not smooth. They were not weathered in the horizontal bands that wind erosion produces over centuries in desert environments. Instead, they displayed deep, undulating, vertical channels, rounded and flowing, cutting through the limestone in patterns that Schoch recognized immediately from his training. These were the signatures of water, not the occasional flash flood that might sweep through a desert wadi after rare storms, but sustained precipitation falling from above, year after year, century after century, carving its testimony into the living rock. This presented an enormous problem. Egypt has been a desert for approximately 5,000 years. The last period of substantial, regular rainfall on the Giza Plateau ended somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 years before the Common Era. During the transition from the African humid period to the arid conditions that persist today, if the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls required centuries of heavy rainfall to form, and if that rainfall ended thousands of years before the pharaohs supposedly carved the monument, then the conventional timeline was not merely wrong. It was impossible. Schoch documented everything with the meticulous care his training demanded. He photographed the erosion patterns, measured the depth of weathering into the subsurface rock, and compared his findings to known examples of precipitation erosion at sites around the world. The match was unmistakable. He presented his conclusions at the Geological Society of America, subjecting them to peer review from scientists who had no investment in Egyptological debates. His colleagues confirmed what he had observed. The stone told a story that contradicted the official narrative by thousands of years. For Schoch, this was the beginning of a long and difficult road. The Egyptological establishment did not welcome his findings, but science, when practiced honestly, does not ask permission from established authorities. It asks questions of the evidence and follows wherever the answers lead. The evidence at Giza was leading somewhere very uncomfortable indeed. Asterisk. To understand why Schock's observations created such controversy, one must first understand how stone remembers the forces that shape it. Erosion is not a single process, but a family of related phenomena, each leaving distinct signatures that trained eyes can read as clearly as written text. The rocks around the Sphinx constitute a document that has been waiting for the right reader for a very long time. Wind erosion, the type that dominates in desert environments, works horizontally. Sand carried by prevailing winds acts like slow sandpaper, wearing away at exposed surfaces over centuries. This process does not treat all rock equally. Limestone consists of alternating layers of harder and softer material, and wind-driven sand preferentially attacks the softer bands, while leaving harder layers protruding. The result is a characteristic pattern of horizontal striations, ledges and recesses that follow the natural bedding planes of the stone. This pattern is visible throughout the Giza Plateau on surfaces that have been exposed to desert conditions for thousands of years. The Sphinx enclosure tells a different story entirely. Its walls display deep, rounded, vertical channels that flow from top to bottom like frozen waterfalls carved in stone. These channels cut through hard and soft limestone alike. This is precisely what happens when water falls from above and runs down a vertical surface over extended periods. The pattern is unmistakable to anyone who has studied rainfall erosion at sites where such weathering is documented and dated. Schock found more than surface patterns. A depth that requires not brief storms but sustained precipitation over centuries or millennia. Flash floods leave different signatures, primarily horizontal, scouring at ground level. The Sphinx enclosure shows vertical weathering from above, exactly consistent with prolonged rainfall of the type that occurred during the African humid period, when the Sahara was green and rivers flowed where sand dunes now stand. Why had this evidence been overlooked for so long? The answer lies in the boundaries between academic disciplines. Egyptologists study inscriptions, artifacts, and cultural remains. Geologists study rocks and the processes that shape them. For nearly 2 centuries, these communities rarely collaborated on the Sphinx question. Egyptologists assumed the monument's age was settled by historical records, and geologists had no particular reason to examine a site they considered archaeologically resolved. The evidence hiding in plain sight required someone willing to cross disciplinary borders and ask questions that neither field had. Thought to pose, Schock went further still. Using seismic equipment, he measured the depth of weathering beneath the Sphinx itself, finding evidence that the monument may have been carved far deeper into the bedrock than its current profile suggests. This implies that the Sphinx we see today has been extensively repaired and possibly reshaped over time, its original form buried beneath layers of restoration. The dynastic Egyptians themselves may have performed on a monument they inherited rather than created. The walls of the enclosure had been speaking for thousands of years. Someone had finally learned to listen, and what they were saying demanded an answer to an uncomfortable question. If not the pharaohs, then who carved this monument, and when? Asterisk. The mathematics of rainfall and erosion lead to conclusions that challenge everything we think we know about human history. If the Sphinx enclosure required centuries of substantial precipitation to develop its characteristic weathering patterns, And if that precipitation ended when the Sahara dried approximately 7,000 years before the Common Era, then the original excavation of the monument must have occurred before that transition. Schock's conservative estimate places the carving of the Sphinx somewhere around 7,000 BCE, possibly earlier. Other researchers examining the same evidence have proposed dates reaching back to 10,500 BCE, aligning with the end of the last ice age. Consider what even the most conservative figure means. 7,000 BCE predates the first Egyptian dynasty by more than 4,000 years. It predates the invention of writing by 3,000 years. It places the creation of the Sphinx in an era when, according to orthodox archaeology, humans were simple hunter-gatherers, incapable of monumental construction. Someone carved a massive lion from the living bedrock of Giza during a period that history insists produced nothing more sophisticated than stone tools and temporary shelters. The questions multiply from here. Who possessed the knowledge and organization to undertake such a project in the Neolithic period? What happened to their civilization? Why does no clear archaeological record of their existence survive? If they could carve the Sphinx, what else might they have built that we have either misattributed or lost entirely? There is a detail that adds another layer to this mystery. The head of the Sphinx displays different weathering patterns than the body, suggesting it may have been recarved at a later date. The head is also notably small in proportion to the body, an anomaly that has puzzled observers for centuries. One explanation reconciles both observations. The Sphinx originally depicted something else, perhaps a lion to match its leonine body, and dynastic Egyptians later reshaped the head into a human form. If true, the monument we see today is a later civilization's modification of something far older that they found already standing when they arrived at Giza. Imagine the first pharaohs approaching this plateau and discovering an ancient lion carved from stone, weathered by rains their own civilization had never known. Gazing east toward a sunrise that had occurred thousands of years before their ancestors existed. They did not build the Sphinx. They inherited it, claimed it, repaired it, and eventually forgot that it had ever been anything other than their own creation. The Sphinx is not the only monument at Giza that holds secrets the official timeline cannot accommodate. The Great Pyramid itself presents mysteries of precision and scale that grow more troubling the closer we examine them. The Great Pyramid of Giza rises from the desert floor with a presence that photographs cannot capture. To stand at its base is to feel genuinely small, not merely in comparison to something large, but in comparison to something that should not exist at all. 2.3 million blocks of stone, averaging 2.5 tons each, stacked to a height of 481 feet across a footprint spanning 13 acres. These numbers alone would make it one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history. But the numbers that truly disturb are not measurements of size. They are measurements of precision. The base of the Great Pyramid is level 2 within 2.1 centimeters across its entire foundation. Consider what this means. 13 acres of limestone bedrock, carved and prepared, achieving a margin of error that modern construction projects with laser-guided equipment would struggle to match. The corners of the pyramid align to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a single degree, a precision that would not be equaled in Europe until the 17th century. The builders accomplished this without magnetic compasses, which did not exist. They accomplished it without telescopes or the mathematical frameworks that later civilizations would develop to achieve similar results. They accomplished it, according to orthodox chronology, using copper tools and human observation alone. The mathematical relationships, encoded in the structure multiply the mystery. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height equals 2 times pi, accurate to several decimal places. This is the same ratio that defines the relationship between a circle's circumference and its radius. According to conventional history, the Egyptians had only a rough approximation of pi and no particular reason to encode it in architecture. Yet there it is, built into the very proportions of the monument. The pyramid sits at almost precisely 30 degrees north latitude, a position that divides the distance between the equator and the North Pole into exact thirds. Choosing this location intentionally would require knowledge of the Earth's dimensions that supposedly did not exist for another 4,000 years. The pyramid's placement also marks a point where the longest land meridian crosses the longest land parallel, making it the geometric center of Earth's landmass. Coincidence remains a possible explanation, but it requires believing in an extraordinary accumulation of coincidences, each one individually improbable, together forming a pattern that strains credulity. None of this proves that the builders possessed advanced technology or connections to lost civilizations, but it does prove something important. Whoever designed the Great Pyramid possessed sophisticated mathematical knowledge, astronomical understanding, and engineering capabilities that we have consistently underestimated. They cared about precision for reasons we do not fully understand. They encoded information into stone with an intentionality that suggests purposes beyond simply housing a dead king. The precision of the design raises difficult questions. The physical reality of the construction raises even more difficult ones, because designing a perfect structure and actually building it are two very different challenges, and the second may be even harder to explain than the first. Asterisk. Theories about how the pyramids were built have circulated for centuries, and each generation has contributed its own confident explanations. Ramps of various configurations appear most frequently. The simple logic of inclined planes applied to the problem of vertical construction. But when engineers examine these proposals with professional rigor, the confidence tends to evaporate. A straight ramp rising from ground level to the pyramid's apex would need to maintain a slope gentle enough for workers to drag multi-ton blocks upward. Calculations show that such a ramp would need to extend more than a mile from the pyramid's base and would require more material to construct than the pyramid itself contains. No evidence of such a massive auxiliary structure has ever been found. Spiral ramps wrapping around the pyramid's exterior eliminate the length problem, but create others. Workers would lose sight of the corners during construction, making it impossible to verify the precise alignments that the finished structure demonstrates. Houdin offer an elegant theoretical solution, but remain entirely speculative. No internal ramp system has been conclusively identified within the pyramid despite modern scanning technology. Beyond the ramps lies a more fundamental problem. The Great Pyramid's interior contains granite beams above the king's chamber, weighing between 25 and 80 tons each. This granite was quarried in Aswan, 500 miles to the south, transported to Giza by methods unknown, and then somehow raised over 200 feet into position within the growing structure. The beams were fitted with such precision that the joints between them remained tight after 4.5 millennia. No experimental archaeology project has demonstrated a method for accomplishing this with Bronze Age technology. Researchers have attempted to replicate pyramid construction at smaller scales using period tools and techniques. A Japanese team in the 1970s tried to build a modest pyramid 1/35 the size of the Great Pyramid. They failed and eventually resorted to modern equipment to complete the project. Other experiments have successfully moved blocks weighing a few tons short distances, but these demonstrations scale poorly. The techniques that work for 2-ton blocks become exponentially more difficult with blocks weighing 10, 20, or 80 tons, and the pyramid required moving millions of blocks, not dozens. The standard response to these difficulties typically involves some variation of patience and manpower. Given enough workers and enough time, the argument goes, almost anything becomes possible. This may be true, but it answers the wrong question. No one doubts that ancient Egyptians had access to labor. What remains unexplained is methodology. How do you coordinate tens of thousands of workers with sufficient precision to achieve 2-centimeter tolerances across 13 acres? How do you lift 80-ton granite beams 200 feet using ropes and wooden levers without catastrophic failures? These are not questions invented by conspiracy theorists seeking sensational answers. They are questions that professional engineers have asked repeatedly, receiving only partial answers and confident hand-waving in return. The pyramid exists, so clearly someone solved these problems. But the solution has been lost, and our best attempts to reconstruct it have consistently fallen short. Perhaps the tools themselves hold answers the methods cannot provide. The tools available to dynastic Egypt are well documented. Copper chisels and saws, stone hammers and pounders, wooden levers and sledges, bronze implements in later periods. These tools built temples and tombs throughout Egyptian history, and their marks are visible on countless monuments. The problem is not whether such tools existed. The problem is whether they could accomplish what the Great Pyramid required. Copper is a soft metal, significantly softer than the granite that forms the pyramid's interior chambers. When copper meets granite, the copper loses. Experiments with replica tools demonstrate that cutting granite using copper blades and sand abrasive is technically possible, but the process is extraordinarily slow. Researchers estimate that shaping the granite coffer in the king's chamber using authenticated ancient methods would require years of continuous work. Yet the pyramid contains not one granite element, but hundreds, each precisely finished, each completed within a construction timeline that orthodox chronology places at roughly 20 years. The surfaces themselves present puzzles. Some finished granite displays a smoothness that suggests polishing techniques beyond simple abrasion. Core-drilled holes found at various sites in Egypt show spiral striations. Engineer Christopher Dunn analyzed these core samples and calculated that the feed rate exceeded what modern diamond-tipped drills achieve under normal operation. His conclusions remain controversial, but critics have not explained the physical evidence he documented. The spiral grooves exist. Something created them. The question is, what mainstream Egyptology responds to these observations with reasonable caution? We should not assume that ancient workers lacked techniques simply because those techniques have not survived in the archaeological record. Craft knowledge can be lost when master artisans die without passing their secrets to successors. This is a fair point, but it is also, essentially, an appeal to mystery. We cannot explain how they did it, so we assume they had methods we do not understand. This assumption may be correct. It may also be too convenient, a placeholder that allows difficult questions to be filed away rather than answered. The tools we have found do not match the work we observe. Either better tools existed and have been lost, or techniques existed that transcended the limitations of the tools we know. Neither explanation is entirely comfortable. The precision, the construction methods, and the tools all point toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Whoever built the Great Pyramid possessed capabilities we have not fully accounted for, and their sophistication did not develop gradually. It appeared as if from nowhere, already fully formed. Civilizations do not typically appear out of nothing. They leave trails, centuries of gradual development visible in the archaeological record like footprints leading toward a destination. Mesopotamia shows this pattern clearly, with primitive settlements evolving over millennia into the cities of Sumer. The Indus Valley reveals similar progressions, small villages growing into the planned urban centers of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. China, Greece, Rome, the Maya civilization left evidence of its learning curve. The failed experiments and incremental improvements that characterize human progress. This is how culture works. It builds upon itself, generation after generation, until sophistication emerges from accumulated knowledge. Ancient Egypt breaks this pattern in ways that have troubled researchers for generations. Around 3001, 100 years before the Common Era, Upper and Lower Egypt unified under the first pharaohs. Within centuries, this newly formed kingdom was producing hieroglyphic writing of remarkable complexity, art that would define aesthetic standards for 3,000 years, religious systems of elaborate sophistication, an architecture that would culminate in monuments we still cannot fully explain. The developmental period that should have preceded such achievements, the centuries of trial and error, the primitive first attempts, the gradual refinement appears, compressed almost beyond recognition. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, constructed around 2670 BC, is conventionally identified as Egypt's first major stone monument. Within just 100 to 150 years, Egyptian builders supposedly progressed from this initial experiment to the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure that represents such an enormous leap in scale, precision, and complexity that the progression strains belief. Imagine the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk. The technological distance is roughly comparable. Pre-dynastic Egypt did exist. Archaeological evidence confirms the presence of earlier cultures along the Nile. The Badarian and Nakadar peoples who left behind pottery, tools, and modest settlements. But the connection between these simple societies and the sudden flowering of dynastic civilization remains unclear. Something happened during the transition that accelerated development beyond any normal pattern, introducing knowledge and capabilities that seemed to have arrived rather than evolved. The ancient They spoke of Zep-Tepi, the first time, an era when gods walked the earth and established the foundations of everything that followed. The wisdom of architecture, astronomy, medicine, and governance, all of it, according to Egyptian tradition, originated not with the pharaohs, but with divine predecessors who existed in an age before recorded history. Mainstream academia interprets these accounts as religious narrative, symbolic rather than literal, but mythology often preserves memory in coded form. Stories of gods may be stories of people whose names and natures were transformed by generations of retelling. What if Zep-Tepi remembers something real? What if Egyptian civilization did not invent its sophistication but inherited it from predecessors whose existence has been forgotten by everyone except those who built upon their legacy? The Egyptians left records that suggest exactly this possibility. Asterisk. We possess an unusual advantage when studying ancient Egypt that we lack for many other civilizations. The Egyptians were obsessive documentarians, recording everything from royal decrees to laundry lists on materials that survived millennia in the dry desert air. Temple walls, papyrus scrolls, and carved stone monuments preserve their words with remarkable fidelity. When we want to know what the Egyptians believed about themselves, we can simply read what they wrote. The difficulty is that what they wrote does not match what modern scholarship has concluded about them. The inventory discovered at Giza contains an account that has generated controversy since its translation. According to this inscription, Pharaoh Khufu did not build the Sphinx but rather repaired it, implying the monument already existed when he came to the throne. The stela also describes Khufu restoring a temple of Isis that stood beside the Sphinx, suggesting an entire sacred complex predating the Pyramid Age. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses this account, dating the stela to a much later period and considering it unreliable propaganda. The reasoning involves stylistic analysis and assumptions about when certain religious practices emerged. Whether this dismissal is conclusive remains a matter of interpretation. The stela exists. Its claims are clear. We have chosen not to believe them. The Palermo stone and the Turin king list present similar challenges. These were official documents, maintained by temple priests, whose responsibility was preserving accurate historical records. Both sources list pharaonic reigns, extending backward through dynastic time with dates and durations that scholars accept as generally reliable. But both sources also continue further into the past, recording reigns of gods and demigods spanning tens of thousands of years before human pharaohs assumed power. The god Osiris ruled for a specific period. The god Horus succeeded him for another specific period. Recorded with the same apparent seriousness as later dynasties. Modern interpretation draws a sharp line between the mythological and historical sections of these records. Everything before the first human pharaohs is dismissed as religious symbolism, while everything after is treated as legitimate history. This distinction may be valid, but we should acknowledge that the ancient Egyptians themselves made no such separation. To them, the reigns of gods were as historical as the reigns of pharaohs, part of an unbroken continuity extending from the first time to their present day. The Egyptian worldview understood civilization not as something they had created but as something they were, restoring and maintaining. Their temples were not innovations but recreations of cosmic patterns established by predecessors. Their knowledge was not discovered but inherited, passed down from an earlier age when beings of greater wisdom walked the earth. This was not primitive superstition, but a sophisticated philosophical framework that shaped every aspect of their culture. If we discovered similar records in any other archaeological context documents, from a lost library claiming institutional continuity from an earlier era, complete with chronological details, we would investigate those claims seriously. We would search for corroborating evidence. We would consider the possibility that oral tradition had preserved genuine historical memory. Why do we extend less curiosity to records carved in stone and preserved for 4,000 years? Perhaps because taking them seriously would require reconsidering everything else we think we know. Texts can be mythologized. their original meanings transformed by generations of retelling until history becomes legend and legend becomes religion. Physical evidence is harder to dismiss, and scattered across the earth, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Peru, structures exist that share characteristics too specific to attribute easily to coincidence. At Abydos, in the Egyptian desert, stands a building unlike any other in the ancient kingdom. Constructed from enormous granite blocks fitted together without mortar or decoration, its architectural style differs completely from the ornate temples surrounding it. Early archaeologists who discovered the structure initially dated it to the earliest dynasties based on its primitive appearance. The dating was later revised when excavations revealed it lay beneath constructions from Seti's reign, leading scholars to conclude it must have been built during his period, despite looking nothing like anything else from that era. The Assyrian remains an anomaly, a building that seems to belong to a different age, a different tradition, possibly a different civilization entirely, thousands of miles away in Turkey. Göbekli Tepe has rewritten what we thought we knew about human capabilities in deep prehistory. Excavated beginning in the 1990s, this site contains massive carved pillars arranged in circles, depicting animals and abstract symbols with sophisticated artistry. The problem is the date. Göbekli Tepe was constructed approximately 12,000 years ago, 7,000 years before the pyramids, at a time when humans were supposedly simple hunter-gatherers, incapable of monumental construction. Its existence proves that sophisticated building traditions existed far earlier than orthodox timelines allowed. If such capabilities existed in Anatolia 12 millennia ago, what might have existed elsewhere? In Peru and Bolivia, megalithic structures display stonework that echoes Egyptian techniques across an ocean that should have been impassable to ancient peoples. At Sacsayhuaman, massive polygonal blocks weighing hundreds of tons fit together with precision that rivals Giza. At Puma Punku, H-shaped stones show consistency, suggesting standardized production. The Incas claimed they did not build these monuments, but found them already standing, relics of an earlier people who had vanished before memory. These parallels do not prove that ancient, though some researchers argue exactly that, but they suggest another possibility, perhaps more profound. What if these scattered monuments represent inheritance from a common source? A civilization old enough that its children could have migrated to separate continents before rising seas isolated them forever. The pyramids may not stand alone. They may be fragments of something larger, echoes of knowledge that once spanned the globe before catastrophe scattered it to the winds. And that knowledge, wherever it originated, appears to have been written in the stars. Robert Bauval was not an astronomer by training. He was an engineer, practical-minded and skeptical by nature, the kind of person who trusted measurements over speculation. But in 1983, while working in Saudi Arabia, he found himself lying beneath a desert sky so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. His eyes settled on Orion's belt. Those three bright stars arranged in a distinctive diagonal line, and a thought occurred to him that would consume the next decade of his life. The three stars were not quite in a row. The smallest was offset, just slightly, from the perfect alignment of the other two. The two larger pyramids, those of Khufu and Kafir, align almost perfectly. The smallest Menkaure pyramid is offset from the line by a small but deliberate amount. When Beauval overlaid maps of the stars onto maps of the pyramids, the correspondence was unmistakable. Even the Nile, flowing past the plateau to the east, corresponded to the position of the Milky Way relative to Orion. This observation alone would have been remarkable, but Beauval pressed further into territory that would make his theory genuinely controversial. The stars do not remain fixed in their positions. Earth's axis wobbles slowly over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, a phenomenon called precession that causes the entire night sky to shift gradually over centuries. The constellation that rises at dawn on the spring equinox today is different from the one that rose 3,000 years ago, and different still from 13,000 years ago. Beauval asked a simple question: when would the correlation between Orion and the pyramids have been most perfect? When would the stars have matched most precisely the angles encoded in the pyramid shafts and the layout of the monuments? He ran the calculations backward through time, watching the virtual sky shift through millennia of precession. The answer that emerged was approximately 10,500 years before the Common Era. This date coincides with the proposed redating of the Sphinx based on water erosion. It coincides with the end of the last ice age and the beginning of a catastrophic period called the Younger Dryas. It coincides with the era that Egyptian mythology identified as Zep Tepi. The first time, the convergence of independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same remote epoch is either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of intentional design encoding a message about origins far older than orthodox chronology allows. Critics have challenged Beauval's methodology, noting that the correlation is imperfect and that pattern recognition can find connections where none exist. These objections deserve serious consideration, but the pyramids were not the only astronomical encoding at Giza. Inside the Great Pyramid, narrow shafts point toward specific targets in the sky with an accuracy that cannot be dismissed as coincidence or projection. Deep within the Great Pyramid, the narrow shafts extend from the two main chambers into the body of the monument. These passages are roughly 8 inches square, too small for any human to traverse, ascending at precise angles through hundreds of feet of solid stone before terminating at or near the pyramid's outer surface. For over a century after their discovery, no one could explain their purpose. They were too small for ventilation, too precisely constructed to be random, and too deliberately aligned to be merely structural. In the 1960s, astronomers began calculating what these shafts would have pointed toward in the ancient sky. The results transformed our understanding of what the pyramid was meant to accomplish. The southern shaft from the king's chamber, ascending at an angle of approximately 45 degrees, targeted the constellation Orion at its meridian transit around 2500 BCE. The Egyptians associated Orion with Osiris, lord of the afterlife and judge of souls. The southern shaft from the queen's chamber targeted Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, associated with the goddess Isis, wife of Osiris and protector of the dead. The northern shafts pointed toward different but equally significant targets. They aligned with stars in the circumpolar region, that area of sky near the celestial pole where stars never set below the horizon. To ancient observers, these eternal stars symbolized immortality, souls that never descended into the darkness of the underworld. The pyramid's shafts created pathways connecting the chambers of the dead to the cosmic, destinations where ancient religion believed the soul would travel. The precision of these alignments reveals Something crucial about the builders. Stars move, not in human timescales, but over centuries. Precession shifts the entire celestial sphere. The alignments that worked around 2500 BCE would not have worked 1,000 years earlier or later. Either the builders constructed these shafts to match the sky of their own era, or they possessed enough astronomical knowledge to calculate where stars would be at a specific date and designed accordingly. Either option implies sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics that we rarely attribute to Bronze Age societies. The shafts encode a time stamp, a moment when their alignments achieved maximum accuracy, but time stamps can be interpreted multiple ways. Did the builders record the date of construction, or did they encode a date significant for other reasons, perhaps pointing backward toward an origin they wished to commemorate? The precession cycle means similar alignments recur over 26,000 years. The sky of 2500 BCE resembled the sky of approximately 10,500 BCE plus 26,000 years. Dates separated by that vast span share astronomical characteristics. What cannot be disputed is that the builders possessed extraordinary knowledge of the heavens. They observed, calculated, and encoded that knowledge in stone with engineering precision we still struggle to replicate. Such understanding does not appear spontaneously. It requires generations of careful observation, recording, and transmission. It also requires knowing where you stand on the earth beneath those stars. Asterisk. The Great Pyramid occupies one of the most mathematically significant locations on the planet. This could be coincidence. It could also be evidence of knowledge that should not have existed when the monument was supposedly built. The pyramid sits almost exactly at 30 degrees north latitude, 1/3 of the distance from the equator to the pole. More remarkably, it occupies the point on Earth's surface where the longest meridian of land crosses the longest parallel of land, the geographic center of our planet's landmass. From this single point, more of Earth's continental surface is visible in all directions than from any other location. Understanding our planet's geography at a level that orthodox history attributes only to modern civilization, the pyramid's dimensions appear to encode additional geographical knowledge. The perimeter of its base, when multiplied by a factor derived from the monument's height, produces a number remarkably close to Earth's polar circumference. The angle of the pyramid's sides incorporates measurements that correspond to the planet's axial tilt. These relationships have been documented and verified, though their significance remains debated. Skeptics argue that with enough measurements, patterns will emerge from any complex structure. Believers counter that the patterns are too precise and too numerous to dismiss as coincidence. Perhaps most striking are the apparent connections between Giza and other ancient sites scattered across the globe. Draw a line from the Great Pyramid through Angkor Wat in Cambodia and extend it around the Earth. This great circle passes through or near Nazca in Peru, Easter Island in the Pacific, and numerous other locations associated with ancient mysteries. The sites are separated by oceans that Bronze Age peoples could not have crossed. Yet they align within a remarkably narrow band around the planet, as if positioned according to a shared system of geographic knowledge. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We find faces in clouds and meaning in random sequences. Some of these geographic correlations may indeed be coincidental, our minds imposing order on chaos. But the accumulation of individually unlikely coincidences eventually becomes its own form of evidence. At what point does the pattern demand explanation rather than dismissal? If the pyramid builders genuinely possessed this knowledge, they had only a few possible sources. Either they developed sophisticated surveying and navigation independently, achieving in the Bronze Age what Europeans required until the 18th century to match, or they inherited their knowledge from predecessors who had already mapped the world, inheritors of a tradition stretching back beyond recorded history, or some combination of both, fragments of older wisdom supplemented by their own observations. The stones of Giza do not answer these questions directly. They only demonstrate that someone, at some time, possessed capabilities we have not fully acknowledged. Egypt stands at one node of this global puzzle, but it does not stand alone. Across oceans and continents, other monuments wait with their own impossible questions, pieces of a pattern too large to see from any single location. For generations, the story of human civilization followed a comforting trajectory. Hunter-gatherers wandered in small bands, surviving on whatever they could find, until approximately 10,000 years ago, when someone in the Fertile Crescent planted the first seeds of agriculture. Farming created surplus. Surplus enabled settlement. Settlements grew into cities, and cities developed the complex social structures necessary for monumental construction. This sequence was not merely theory but doctrine, the foundation upon which archaeology built its understanding of human progress. Then a German archaeologist began digging in a Turkish hillside, and the entire framework began to collapse. Klaus Schmidt arrived at Göbekli Tepe in 1994. Local farmers had known about the site for years, dismissing the strange stones protruding from the soil as remnants of a medieval cemetery. Schmidt recognized something different. What emerged from the earth over the following decades defied everything the textbooks claimed to know about prehistoric humanity. Massive limestone pillars, some weighing 20 tons, arranged in careful circles. Sophisticated relief carvings depicting animals and abstract symbols, executed with artistic skill that would be impressive in any era. T-shaped megaliths standing over 15 feet tall, positioned with obvious intentionality in configurations that suggested ritual purpose. And the dates that carbon testing returned were staggering. The oldest portions of Göbekli Tepe were constructed around 9,600 years before the Common Era. This was more than 6,000 years before the Great Pyramid, 5,000 years before the first known writing systems, and several thousand years before agriculture supposedly enabled complex society to exist. Hunter-gatherers built this. Such resource investment, such sophisticated artistic expression. They should have been too busy surviving to carve 20-ton pillars with images of lions and vultures and serpents. Yet the evidence stands in the Turkish highlands, undeniable and unexplained. Perhaps most unsettling is what happened to the site. Around 8000 BCE, after approximately 2 millennia of use, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not abandoned and left to decay, not destroyed by enemies, but intentionally covered with earth and debris by people who apparently wanted to preserve or protect it. The burial was so thorough that the site remained hidden until modern excavation exposed it. Why would builders capable of such magnificent construction choose to hide their achievement? What were they protecting it from? What did they know was coming? Göbekli Tepe does not directly prove that the Sphinx is older than Egyptologists claim, or that the pyramids encode knowledge from a lost civilization. But it proves something almost as important. It proves that our understanding of prehistoric human capability has been fundamentally wrong. The neat timeline of progress, from primitive to sophisticated, from simple to complex, does not match the physical evidence emerging from the ground. Sophisticated construction was possible far earlier than anyone believed. The boundaries of what ancient peoples could accomplish have been officially expanded. If such monuments could be built in Turkey 12,000 years ago, the question is no longer whether similar achievements were possible elsewhere. The question becomes, what else might have existed in that deep past? What other marvels might have risen and fallen in an era we dismissed as primitive, leaving only scattered fragments for us to puzzle over millennia later? The fragments are not limited to Turkey. Across an ocean, in the mountains of South America, stones were shaped with precision that rivals anything at Giza, high in the Andes, where the air thins and the mountains scrape against the sky. Ancient builders left monuments that should not exist. The Spanish conquistadors, who first encountered these structures in the 16th century, were hardened soldiers, unimpressed by foreign wonders after years of conquest. Yet even they paused in astonishment at walls built from stones larger than any in Europe, fitted together with a precision their own civilization could not match. At Sacsayhuaman, overlooking the city of Cusco, massive limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons interlock like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. The stones are not uniform rectangles stacked in neat rows. They are irregular polygons, each one unique, each one carved to fit precisely against its neighbors, with joints so tight that a sheet of paper cannot slip between them. Gravity and geometric perfection alone have kept these walls standing through 5 centuries of earthquakes that have leveled European-style buildings around them. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, the precision becomes almost mechanical. H-shaped blocks display right angles so perfect they could pass quality control in a modern factory. Identical pieces appear to have been manufactured to standardized specifications, implying not just skill but systematic production. The stone is andesite, one of the hardest materials on Earth, yet it was cut and polished to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. At Ollantaytambo, up steep slopes and across rivers to be fitted into place at elevations that challenge even modern logistics. The how of this accomplishment remains unexplained. The why remains equally mysterious. When the Spanish asked the Incas who had built these wonders, the answer was honest and unsettling. The Incas did not know. They had found these structures already standing when their civilization arose. The walls predated their memory, their legends, their oldest stories. Whoever had built them had vanished so completely that even their name had been forgotten. The parallels to Egypt are striking. Massive scale, impossible precision, transportation methods that defy reconstruction, stones shaped with techniques we cannot replicate, and civilizations that claimed not invention but inheritance, building upon foundations laid by predecessors whose identity had been lost to time. These similarities do not prove that ancient Egyptians sailed to Peru, or that Peruvians crossed the Atlantic to study at Giza, but they suggest something equally profound. Multiple peoples, separated by oceans and millennia, somehow developed remarkably similar capabilities for working stone at scales that still challenge explanation. Either these represent independent inventions, parallel solutions to common problems, or they represent inheritance from a common source, fragments of knowledge dispersed across the globe from an origin. we have not yet identified. The pattern extends further still. The easy aftermath of catastrophe for nearly 100,000 miles, and the survivors emerged to rebuild much of the volcanic rock so remote that its original inhabitants developed one of the most isolated cultures of frozen water to come from nowhere. Yet this tiny island, possessing knowledge barely 50 square miles ago, windswept terrain, offering the foundations upon which new civilizations would rise. Then, with increased Egyptians remembered the ice as the Shemsu and the glaciers first arrived, the followers of coastline shifted. Lineage of sages bridged the age of gods along the coastline. Life returned to regions their elongated foxes gave inland for long. Astronomers and architects preserved wisdom. The ice age was 30 feet tall, and a new those who came afterwards. Then the king were cast from 12,800 years ago, tens of thousands of years, into the transported miles across rough terrain to their final possession from an older civilization to a younger one, struggling to uncover what had required sophisticated engineering within decades. They were carefully leveled the glaciers supporting the immense emerged from the spring wearing that had begun to green above the northern land. Dutch explorers they taught humanity for another 1,200 years, writing, conditions, agriculture, astronomy, superstition, law, period scientists, each one they served a different king. After a spiritual power teaching was complete, reappeared and reappeared as mysteriously as modern researchers dismissed this. Their images appeared until experiments and cause of the controversial demonstrating some hybrid figures. Various vessels only emerged and coordinated teams. In Peru, then statues came across the water team of after a great flood destroyed an earlier world would prove increasingly across the ancestors of the Incas how something had fallen how to cultivate. The evidence the island was a thin layer of sediment. He travelled across the land across generations. They established the sacred site onset of the young west across the Pacific. Within this layer, the walking technique works in Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, for the largest maybe present challenges, formed a feather under extreme pressure, who brought knowledge. They found a precision of the rare platforms, architecture, engineering knowledge, pyramids of their surface for an isolated different culture, tiny grass and sheer ambition when different cultures separated and garbage and millennia thousands the atmosphere of contact on an these are the same stories left by the impact implies organizational capability. 66 teachers demand years ago they possessed knowledge that ceased to divine because it was so represented the earth that dawned global history on their own. The proposed scenarios sophisticated stone contradictions appear preserved unlike asteroid fragment, and then they vanish. Possibly several fragments to work to carry forward North American memory or describing processes with these natural until science catches archetype. The impact triggered the catastrophic flooding as glacial did into mythological framework that reshaped continents where they garbled memories of the same injected into the atmosphere. Travelers who somehow reached scattered across triggering a nuclear winter effect. Characteristics or suggest evidence of a coordinated weather pattern or some survivor connection for lost civilization who dispersed across us do not cost a desperate attempt to species that had survived the entire ice around Pacific went extinct within generations. The answers may be encoded in the very stones they told us when something profound happened to human civilization. What supported by evidence from sites across North America, it left only scattered fragments and the Middle East of continuous history. The black mat layer requires us to confront a possibility that challenges everything we think we know about our past. Each one telling the same story of sudden, catastrophic change, and the stones that remain civilization existed before this event. The impact would explain much about why so little evidence remains. Coastal settlements would have been drowned by rising seas. Inland populations would have faced climate collapse, resource failure, and the chaos that follows catastrophe. What took generations to build could have been destroyed in months. And the survivors, scattered and diminished, would have carried only fragments of what had been lost. Memories that would fade into mythology within a few generations. But some memories proved remarkably persistent, across cultures that should have had no contact. The same story would be told again and again. Asterisk, the oldest surviving work of literature tells of a great flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, recorded on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia, a man named Utnapishtim receives divine warning that the gods intend to destroy humanity with water. He builds a vessel, loads it with his family and the seed of all living things, and survives while the world drowns around him. When the waters recede, he releases birds to find land, eventually receiving the blessing of immortality for preserving life through the cataclysm. This story predates the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years, yet the parallels are unmistakable. Divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel of salvation, birds sent to find dry ground, a covenant established in the aftermath. The similarities led scholars to conclude that the Hebrew version borrowed from the Mesopotamian original, a straightforward case of cultural transmission along ancient trade routes. But the flood story does not stop at the borders of the ancient Near East. In Hindu tradition, Manu receives warning from a fish avatar of Vishnu that a great deluge is coming. He builds a boat and survives, becoming the ancestor of all subsequent humanity. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus, repopulating the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders that transform into people. In China, the hero Yu tames the waters of a great flood that had devastated civilization for generations. The pattern extends to cultures that had no contact with the Mediterranean world. Indigenous peoples across North and South America preserve flood traditions. Australian Aboriginal stories speak of ancient inundations that reshaped the coastline. Pacific Islanders tell of ancestors who survived rising waters to establish new homes on scattered islands. Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas. Isolated ocean cultures with no possible historical contact or remember a time when water covered the world. Orthodox scholarship explains this universality in two ways. Either these stories preserve memories of local floods, exaggerated over time into cosmic events, or they represent independent expressions of a common human archetype, the fear of drowning transformed into narrative. Both explanations are reasonable. Neither quite accounts for the specific details that recur across cultures with no mutual influence. The warning from a divine or supernatural source, the construction of a vessel, the survival of a remnant who must restart civilization, the birds or other animals sent to test the waters. These elements appear to consistently to be coincidental elaboration. What if the simplest explanation is also the most disturbing? What if cultures around the world remember the same flood because there was a flood that affected the entire world? The Younger Dryas impact, striking ice sheets containing enough frozen water to raise sea levels by hundreds of feet, would have produced exactly such a cataclysm, and the survivors, wherever they found refuge, would have carried that memory forward. The story that explained why their world had ended and how life had begun again. If survivors existed, some of them may have carried more than stories. Some may have carried knowledge. The ice was aftermath of catastrophe for nearly 100,000 years, and the survivors emerged to rebuild much. Something remarkable happened across the ancient what would become Canada, teachers of northern Europe, beneath sheets of frozen water seemed to come from nowhere. Possessing knowledge around 15,000 years ago, offering the foundations upon which new civilizations would rise. Then with increasing the Egyptians speed, remembered the ice melted as the Shemsu and the glaciers pulled back. The followers of Horus, coastline shifted, a lineage of sages who bridged the age of gods and the age of men returned to regions they were that had been locked in permafrost for longer. Astronomers than human and architects who preserved wisdom through the ice age was ending and transmitted it to those who came after. Then the king lists approximately 12,800 years ago, tens of thousands of years into the past, may preserve memory of this transition. Temperatures that had been rising from an older civilization to a younger one, struggling to recover 15 degrees in some regions in Mesopotamia within decades. They were called the Apkallu. The glaciers advanced sages who emerged from the brief spring wearing that had begun to green the northern lands turned back to winter. They taught humanity the arts for another 1,200 years. Writing, conditions returned to astronomy, severity, medicine, law. A period scientists called the younger served a different king after a small, and when their teaching was complete, that reappeared they in disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived for thousands of years. Their images appeared in Assyrian and Babylonian cause of this art. Sudden reversal remained hybrid figures. Various theories of sacred knowledge and faded. In Peru, then Viracocha came from across the waters. A team of researchers after a great flood had destroyed an earlier world that would prove increasingly difficult the ancestors of the Incas how to build, had fallen from how to cultivate. The evidence came from a thin layer of sediment. He traveled across the land performing miracles and established sacred to the onset of the younger Dryas. Before walking west across the Pacific before this layer vanishing. Scientists in Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl microscopic crystals formed a feathered serpent deity pressure who brought knowledge. They found iridium, a rare element, common architecture to peoples who would build pyramids of their surface. Different they found spirals, tiny different faces created when rock is vaporized, cultures separated and by oceans and millennia back with no possibility of contact. These are the same story echoed by the impact that killed the dinosaurs after the catastrophe 66 million years ago. They possessed knowledge that seemed divine because it was so far beyond that the survivors could achieve on their own. The proposed scenario established priesthoods to contradictions to preserve that knowledge or asteroid fragment, and then they vanished, possibly several leaving their students to carry forward the North American ice they had managed with enough force to vaporize these independent inventions of a universal archetype. The impact triggered a catastrophic flooding as glacial projected onto mythological screens that reshaped continents. Were they garbled memories of the same individuals into the atmosphere? Travelers who somehow reached distant shores, triggering a nuclear winter recovery that plunged global temperatures of a coordinated weather patterns for survivors of a lost civilization, wildfires who dispersed across the continents in a desperate attempt to ensure that had survived the entire ice age would not be completely forgotten within generations. The answers may be encoded in the very stones they taught their students has gained significant acceptance in recent years, supported by evidence from sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. The black matte layer that marks this boundary has been identified at dozens of locations, each one telling the same story of sudden, catastrophic change. If an advanced human civilization existed before this event, the impact would explain much about why so little evidence remains. Coastal settlements would have been drowned by rising seas. Inland populations would have faced climate collapse, resource failure, and the chaos that follows catastrophe. What took generations to build could have been destroyed in months, and the survivors, scattered and diminished, would have carried only fragments of what had been lost, memories that would fade into mythology within a few generations. But some memories proved remarkably persistent, across cultures that should have had no contact. The same story would be told again and again. Asterisk, the oldest surviving work of literature tells of a great flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, recorded on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia, a man named Utnapishtim receives divine warning that the gods intend to destroy humanity with water. He builds a vessel, loads it with his family and the seed of all living things, and survives while the world drowns around him. When the waters recede, he releases birds to find land, eventually receiving the blessing of immortality for preserving life through the cataclysm. This story predates the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years, yet the parallels are unmistakable. Divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel of salvation, birds sent to find dry ground, a covenant established in the aftermath. The similarities led scholars to conclude that the Hebrew version borrowed from the Mesopotamian original. a straightforward case of cultural transmission along ancient trade routes. But the flood story does not stop at the borders of the ancient Near East. In Hindu tradition, Manu receives warning from a fish avatar of Vishnu that a great deluge is coming. He builds a boat and survives, becoming the ancestor of all subsequent humanity. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a flood sent by Zeus, repopulating the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders that transform into people. In China, the hero Yu tames the waters of a great flood that had devastated civilization for generations. The pattern extends to cultures that had no contact with the Mediterranean world. Indigenous peoples across North and South America preserve flood traditions. Australian Aboriginal stories speak of ancient inundations that reshaped the coastline. Pacific Islanders tell of ancestors who survived rising waters to establish new homes on scattered islands. Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas. Isolated ocean cultures with no possible historical contact or remember a time when water covered the world. Orthodox scholarship explains this universality in two ways. Either these stories preserve memories of local floods, exaggerated over time into cosmic events, or they represent independent expressions of a common human archetype, the fear of drowning transformed into narrative. Both explanations are reasonable. Neither quite accounts for the specific details that recur across cultures with no mutual influence. The warning from a divine or supernatural source, the construction of a vessel, the survival of a remnant who must restart civilization, the birds or other animals sent to test the waters. These elements appear to consistently to be coincidental elaboration. What if the simplest explanation is also the most disturbing? What if cultures around the world remember the same flood because there was a flood that affected the entire world? The Younger Dryas impact, striking ice sheets containing enough frozen water to raise sea levels by hundreds of feet, would have produced exactly such a cataclysm, and the survivors, wherever they found refuge, would have carried that memory forward. The story that explained why their world had ended and how life had begun again. If survivors existed, some of them may have carried more than stories. Some may have carried knowledge. In the aftermath of catastrophe, when the waters receded and the survivors emerged to rebuild, something remarkable happened across the ancient world. Teachers appeared, wise figures who seemed to come from nowhere, possessing knowledge that should not have existed, offering the foundations upon which new civilizations would rise. The Egyptians remembered them as the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, a lineage of sages who bridged the age of gods and the age of men. They were keepers of sacred knowledge, astronomers and architects who preserved wisdom through the darkness and transmitted it to those who came after. The king lists that record divine reigns, extending tens of thousands of years into the past, may preserve memory of this transition. The handoff from an older civilization to a younger one, struggling to recover what had been lost in Mesopotamia. They were called the Apkallu, 7 sages who emerged from the sea wearing cloaks that made them appear fish-like. They taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, agriculture, astronomy, medicine, law. Each one served a different king, and when their teaching was complete, they disappeared as mysteriously as they had arrived. Their images appear in Assyrian and Babylonian art, strange hybrid figures carrying vessels of sacred knowledge. In Peru, Viracocha came from across the waters after a great flood had destroyed an earlier world. He taught the ancestors of the Incas how to build, how to cultivate, how to live in society. He traveled through the land performing miracles and establishing sacred sites. before walking west across the Pacific and vanishing. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl served the same function, a feathered serpent deity who brought knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, and architecture to peoples who would build pyramids of their own. Different names, different faces, different cultures separated by oceans and millennia with no possibility of contact. Yet the same story echoes across them all. After the catastrophe, teachers came. They possessed knowledge that seemed divine because it was so far beyond what survivors could achieve on their own. They established priesthoods and traditions to preserve that knowledge, and then they vanished, leaving their students to carry forward what fragments they had managed to absorb. Were these independent inventions of a universal archetype? The human need for savior figures projected onto mythological screens? Were they garbled memories of the same individuals, travelers who somehow reached distant shores to plant seeds of recovery? Or were they evidence of a coordinated effort, survivors of a lost civilization who dispersed across the globe in a desperate attempt to ensure that everything they knew would not be completely forgotten? The answers may be encoded in the very stones they taught their students to shape. The eternal story of the face of Egyptian civilization traces of our present. Each generation descends upon the past across technology between garbage fills and those language archaeologists from the history points will learn far beyond skyscrapers to realm from media civilizations appearing documented pinnacle of this ascent to astronomical knowledge ever himself as the definitive logic and matters relating to the ever existed his relationship with alternative sources structures, languages of myths, human history, the outside shocks geological today would be civilizations rising time forms waves against a shore extend that time's achievements largely every writing system calling him use and other civilizations first to scratch the suggested contemporary centuries earlier members of organic projects. This is my geometry orthodox time. It is certain recognition. They often sound to nothing than what survives archives of civilizations throughout the recorded history collapse to necessarily collection of Alexandria, most minor institutions and countless other territories reduced to catastrophic failure across the Eastern Mediterranean fragments of culture. The world flourished recorded history massive recorded history fragments externalized the listing fragments to what actually not towards those against each civilization builders of thrashed intertwined with archaeology and comprehensive narrative serves individual human catastrophe itself. International civilizations may be exactly such a message. Knowledge that makes construction society decode preserves lost within generations. Catastrophe disrupts geological processes to multiply the demonstrates to vegetation changes. Proportions incorporate face our own ratio that appears throughout the field as disruption of agriculture, population distribution, thinkers, ice glaciers, calculated. 400 civilization within hours circulated specific examples to accuracy can emerge suddenly ancient civilizations vast in a measurement where credible evidence and has not previous population and by association is correlation civilization follow years critics argue that the cities the same naturally created golden numbers buried under carrying accumulated towards of place. We have explored as usual like some cultures tested excavated less than what is healthy archaeological accumulation of surface populations that established conflicts preserved agricultural diversity on the assumption evidence from unexamined territory they may constitute evidence of absence to distinguish as civilization. If the builders inside the conquest are irresistible, they succeed in structuring reasonable expectations this kind of thinking refuted. Japan survived the civilization of the mathematical precision of the great pyramid to ensure the natural formations. Only acknowledged curiosity remains readable. The message is required to measure their archaeology to calculate understood whatever else has been. The particularly investigations more challenge documented facts that official narratives to address the wrong kind of silence lost can contain calculated gracious questions. They can sophisticated technologies seal spaces where physical records materials not yet discovered from the elements. Perhaps institutional history of recent fade as older orthodoxy spaces way to avoid monumental construction to accommodate except for some 2017 purposes. Until then, an international team of physicists have not found announced a discovery only question headlines around the world and the places where other civilization was truly lost. Patient detects cosmic waves in the size of us living now. Asterisk. When civilizations faced a large void inside the Great Pyramid, accept oblivion this quietly. Chamber, at least 100 those who see the end approaching, sits above the grand gallery final in a location where no known passage exists. That the accumulated wisdom of pyramid construction does not vanish entirely when the lights go out. Unexplored history offers numerous examples hidden in how knowledge persists for over 4,000 years, carried by individuals. No one knows what it contains. Who understood that ideas can outlive the institutions that created them. The big void, when the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe descended into centuries of fragmentation. Irish monks became the unarchaeologists first entered the relieving chambers. Above the king's chamber, in the 19th century, at the edge of the known world, they found spaces that had been sealed manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost. Even the ancient work of philosophy, literature. In 1954, science through the long workers discovered a pit until the Renaissance could rediscover containing a full-sized wooden boat. They did not need great libraries. Disassembled, they needed dedication, preserved, patience, waiting for the pharaohs' understanding through the afterlife. What they carried mattered. These discoveries prone survival. That the pyramids still held secrets even after centuries of exploration. Persecution hid the shafts extending from the queen's chamber have yielded their own mysteries across Himalayan passes. Too narrow for human exploration. Rather than surrender, they were examined using small robots in the 1990s, accumulated over centuries. The robot Jewish scholars what appeared to be small doors blocking the passages, memorized entire complete with copper handles. Becoming living lies beyond those doors remains unknown, but not destroyed. Proposals to drill through knowledge and preservation requires redundancy. Legends speak of other chambers, copies in multiple forms distributed across multiple locations. That controversial inscription dismissed by mainstream scholars. Everything mentions a house of survivors of a lost civilization that supposedly contained records of the monument's original construction. They would have employed similar strategies still as the hall of records. Knowledge in the geometry of monuments hypothetical creates records that endure beyond according to various traditions. Embedding information in the lost civilization ensures transmission for future discovery. Even when writing is impossible, no archaeological evidence confirms teaching this for initiation rituals. But ground-penetrating understanding within detected anomalies that beneath persist when physical artifacts unexplored, destroyed. The temples of ancient Egypt evidence is not evidence of schools where initiates spent years mastering astronomy with particular force. Mathematics, where comprehensive and other excavation has been prevented. This knowledge was not freely available, but carefully guarded. Or instituted from teacher to student through generations of a fraction of what may exist beneath the Giza Plateau appears in cultures worldwide. The pyramids themselves may contain spaces that muon tomography cannot detect, that preserve specialized knowledge within closed communities of practice that have never been masked. Certain symbols, every generation of investigators has assumed that the major discoveries were complete. The serpent represents wisdom. Previous explorers had found to India, to Mesoamerica. Every geometric pattern proven wrong in sacred art. The big void was detected using technology that did not exist 20 years ago. The spiral. Future technologies may reveal chambers we cannot remarkable consistency through cultures of the separated by oceans and ages. Revelations may yet represent universal human archetypes and fortunate independently from permitted psychology. But access,
or perhaps
as
they are
fragments of a shared symbolic language, always granted to those who ask uncomfortable questions across the globe. Before catastrophe scattered their students to the winds, we may already possess knowledge from the lost civilization without recognizing it, traditions we practice without understanding, symbols we revere without knowing why, techniques we employ without questioning. Their origin, any of these, might carry encoded wisdom from an age we have forgotten. The inheritance may be hiding in plain sight, waiting for descendants wise enough to recognize what their ancestors left behind. Asterisk. The decades is one figure dominates an unknown face of Egyptian archaeology. Civilization existed before the younger drives catastrophe. Mesopotamia, where remains become steadily secondary traces of our presence. Each generation goes upon the achievements of its predecessors across continents. Technology improved between garbage fills, landfills, and those who wish to investigate for history points has ever extended far beyond the practical skyscrapers. Cremation, how is from the media personality, a civilization appearing with the pinnacle of this ascent, to encode the most advanced knowledge and position himself as the definitive teachers of all matters relating to the curiosity have left more his relationship with alternative stories collegial and a collection of myths. How is human history is not shocks down geological evidence, but civilizations rising, time falling, where the science to shore we expect to find achievements largely archaeological record is fragmented, calling him and other civilizations the first to reach the stars, suggested contempt rather than scholarly disagrees. Earlier members when researchers proposed projects is my challenge orthodox timeline. It is pattern recognition. They often sound to a longer time scale than we get access to stone and fire. Their civilization and throughout recorded history resistant collapse not necessarily across millennial. Most of Maya abandoned their cities, protect their territory. The Bronze Age was medieval Europe, catastrophic failure across the eastern Mediterranean, and fragments of cultures collapsed. The flourished occurred recorded history embarrassed the consensus history. Fragments funding exposed timelines to 12,000 years listing frameworks to what possibility of earlier cycles become threatened to overturn them. Probability and in each civilization builders of the national pride intertwined whoever they were. Theology seemed to complex ways would have faced a different narrative serves individual human catastrophe itself. International civilizations are mortal. Suggested population knowledge that makes complex society possible preserves lost within generations. Subsequent catastrophe disrupts geological processes. Wisdom climate change centuries to vegetation changes. Legitimate human activity face our own responsibility as well. Or recycle threatens disruption of agriculture, rose population distribution, wishful thinkers, the ice glacier survived scrutiny. 400 alternative theory has a 40-story civilization within every coast circulated among audiences recent experience to accuracy can emerge suddenly. Advanced civilizations before histories can be almost entertainment value. We unlock credible evidence and has transportation research and by association. Ancients, if a pre-academization followers pattern developing expertise cities the same naturally create field voyager golden record training buried under carrying accumulated toward interstellar space. We have explored as usual lie somewhere ocean now foundation middle ground. We have excavated less than what is healthy archaeological sites we know exist on lands that established confound alternative theories agricultural diversity on the assumption of catastrophe evidence from unexamined territory they may constitute evidence of absent messages to distinguishable from suppression. When it comes to overcome wearing a costume being irresistible, subdued structures have discovered thinkers this kind of been refuted. Japan, artifacts from the civilization that saw destruction under the Great Pyramid to ensure never natural formations or undated curiosity. The messages required for underwater archaeology have now yet fully understood what they try to tell us. Particularly from investigations that might challenge their example documented facts made official narratives civilization would for the wrong kind of evidence of the lost. Future generations they could not escape questions to be sophisticated. Perhaps technologies not yet invented will primarily change materials not yet discovered. Perhaps institutional resistance will fade as older orthodoxies
perhaps they
give way to new
avoided
monumental construction
willing to accommodate
except
uncomfortable
for
evidence.
sacred purposes. Until then, we do questions what we have not found, and the most profound question that we have barely begun to look in the places where if a civilization was truly lost, patient and silent, what does that loss the waves in the sand for those of us living now? Asterisk, when civilizations face destruction, they do not typically accept oblivion quietly. Those who see the end approaching often dedicate their final efforts to ensuring that something survives, that the accumulated wisdom of generations does not vanish entirely when the lights go out. History offers numerous examples of how knowledge persists through catastrophe, carried by individuals who understood that ideas can outlive the institutions that created them. When the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe descended into centuries of fragmentation, Irish monks became the unexpected saviors of classical learning. In remote monasteries on a rainy island at the edge of the known world, they copied manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost, preserving philosophy, literature, and science through the long darkness until the Renaissance could rediscover them. They did not need great libraries. They needed dedication, patience, and the understanding that what they carried mattered more than their own survival. Tibetan communities facing Chinese persecution hid sacred texts in caves and carried scriptures across Himalayan passes, rather than surrender the knowledge their tradition had accumulated over centuries. Jewish scholars during pogroms and persecutions memorized entire books of the Torah, becoming living libraries that persecution could scatter but not destroy. Knowledge preservation requires redundancy, multiple copies in multiple forms distributed across multiple locations, so that no single catastrophe can erase everything. If survivors of a lost civilization wished to preserve their essential wisdom, they would have employed similar strategies. Encoding knowledge in the geometry of monuments creates records that endure beyond any written document. Embedding information in oral traditions ensures transmission, even when writing is impossible or forbidden. Teaching through initiation rituals preserves understanding within human lineages that persist when physical artifacts are destroyed. The temples of ancient Egypt functioned as schools where initiates spent years mastering astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other disciplines. This knowledge was not freely available but carefully guarded, transmitted from teacher to student through generations of unbroken lineage. The same pattern appears in cultures worldwide: mystery schools, shamanic traditions that preserve specialized knowledge within closed communities of practice. Certain symbols appear across cultures that should have had no contact. The serpent represents wisdom in traditions from Egypt to India to Mesoamerica. Specific geometric patterns recur in sacred art across continents and millennia. The cross, the spiral, the tree of life. These images persist with remarkable consistency through cultures separated by oceans and ages. Perhaps they represent universal human archetypes arising independently from common psychology. Or perhaps they are fragments of a shared symbolic language, remnants of teachings that spread across the globe. Before catastrophe scattered their students to the winds, we may already possess knowledge from the lost civilization without recognizing it, traditions we practice without understanding, symbols we revere without knowing why, techniques we employ without questioning. Their origin, any of these, might carry encoded wisdom from an age we have forgotten. The inheritance may be hiding in plain sight, waiting for descendants wise enough to recognize what their ancestors left behind. Asterisk. The objection is reasonable and deserves an honest answer. In this story, an advanced civilization existed approximately 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and has been advancing steadily ever since. Traces of our presence. Each generation builds upon the achievements of its predecessors. Sprawl across continents. Technology improves. Our garbage fills landfills that will puzzle future archaeologists for millennia. History points ever upward. Our dead rest in cemeteries, caves to modern skyscrapers, and cremation urns. From stone tools to silicon chips, a civilization sophisticated at the pinnacle of this ascent, enough to encode the most advanced knowledge who have ever lived, and dispatch teachers across us with a mixture of curiosity have left more evidence than it. But what if this story is incomplete and a collection of myths? What if human history is not a straight line but a cycle? But absence of evidence rising entirely and falling like waves against a shore. What we expect each to find one's achievements largely erased before the next is fragmentary. Even for civilizations first to reach for the stars, mere structures decay within centuries, whose earlier members have been forgotten. Materials dissolve. This is not pessimism. It is pattern recognition, iron rust applied to a longer timescale than we typically consider. Stone and fired clay. Civilizations and even throughout recorded history have collapsed to persist across millennia. Fell. Most of Maya abandoned their cities, vanished. The Bronze Age of what medieval Europe catastrophic has crumbled. Failure across the eastern Mediterranean and fragments of cultures that flourished within recorded history. Brief window of recorded history. Those fragments into complete timelines that 12,000 years bear little resemblance to what possibility of earlier cycles becomes not speculation but probability. Civilization, the builders of the thrived before 12. Whoever they were, 1,800 years ago, would have faced additional erasure. Individual human catastrophe itself would have destroyed civilizations are mortal, scattered populations, the knowledge that makes complex society possible that preserves lost within generations. The subsequent catastrophe would have added geological processes, wisdom climate that took centuries to accumulate can vanish in years, and human activity we face our own vulnerabilities. Or recycled whatever threatens disruptions to agriculture rose approximately 400 feet. As the Ice Age glaciers melted possible. 400 feet is roughly the height of a 40-story civilization within hours. Every coastline on Earth pandemic shifted inland as recent experience demonstrates, or tens of miles can emerge suddenly. Advanced civilizations before histories can be clustered along coasts. We are not immune to the forces that have ended previous human populations. And perhaps the ancients, if a pre-flood civilization followed this pattern, impulse that built the pyramids, cities was the same impulse that created the Voyager golden record. Buried under carrying accumulated toward interstellar space. We have explored less than 5% of the ocean floor. Foundations 10,000 excavated less than 1% to keep the archaeological sites we know exist on land. Impulse that established the Svalbard declaration that no loss of agricultural diversity rests on the assumption that absence of evidence from unexamined territory they may have constitutes evidence of absence. Messages to survivors of disasters. We hope will never come wearing the costume of inevitable. Submerged structures have been discovered off the coasts of India. Thinking. Japan, artifacts from the civilization that saw destruction remain unexplored, built to ensure as natural formations or undated curiosities. Their resources required for underwater archaeology have not yet fully understood what they were trying to tell us, particularly for investigations that might challenge from their established frameworks, may determine whether our own civilization will join for the wrong kind of evidence of the lost, or breaks the civilization they could not resemble our own to be sophisticated. Perhaps they built primarily with materials that do not survive. Perhaps their population was small but highly skilled. Perhaps they deliberately avoided monumental construction except for specific sacred purposes. We do not know what we have not found. We only know that we have barely begun to look in the places where answers might wait, patient and silent beneath the waves in the sand. Asterisk, when civilizations face destruction. They do not typically accept oblivion quietly. Those who see the end approaching often dedicate their final efforts to ensuring that something survives, that the accumulated wisdom of generations does not vanish entirely when the lights go out. History offers numerous examples of how knowledge persists through catastrophe, carried by individuals, who understood that ideas can outlive the institutions that created them. When the Roman Empire collapsed and Europe descended into centuries of fragmentation, Irish monks became the unexpected saviors of classical learning. In remote monasteries on a rainy island at the edge of the known world, they copied manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost, preserving philosophy, literature, and science through the long darkness until the Renaissance could rediscover them. They did not need great libraries. They needed dedication, patience, and the understanding that what they carried mattered more than their own survival. Tibetan communities facing Chinese persecution hid sacred texts in caves and carried scriptures across Himalayan passes, rather than surrender the knowledge their tradition had accumulated over centuries. Jewish scholars during pogroms and persecutions memorized entire books of the Torah, becoming living libraries that persecution could scatter but not destroy. Knowledge preservation requires redundancy, multiple copies in multiple forms distributed across multiple locations, so that no single catastrophe can erase everything. If survivors of a lost civilization wished to preserve their essential wisdom, they would have employed similar strategies. Encoding knowledge in the geometry of monuments creates records that endure beyond any written document. Embedding information in oral traditions ensures transmission, even when writing is impossible or forbidden. Teaching through initiation rituals preserves understanding within human lineages that persist when physical artifacts are destroyed. The temples of ancient Egypt functioned as schools where initiates spent years mastering astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and other disciplines. This knowledge was not freely available but carefully guarded, transmitted from teacher to student through generations of unbroken lineage. The same pattern appears in cultures worldwide: mystery schools, shamanic traditions that preserve specialized knowledge within closed communities of practice. Certain symbols appear across cultures that should have had no contact. The serpent represents wisdom in traditions from Egypt to India to Mesoamerica. Specific geometric patterns recur in sacred art across continents and millennia. The cross, the spiral, the tree of life. These images persist with remarkable consistency through cultures separated by oceans and ages. Perhaps they represent universal human archetypes arising independently from common psychology. Or perhaps they are fragments of a shared symbolic language, remnants of teachings that spread across the globe. Before catastrophe scattered their students to the winds, we may already possess knowledge from the lost civilization without recognizing it, traditions we practice without understanding, symbols we revere without knowing why, techniques we employ without questioning. Their origin, any of these, might carry encoded wisdom from an age we have forgotten. The inheritance may be hiding in plain sight, waiting for descendants wise enough to recognize what their ancestors left behind. Asterisk. We tell ourselves a story about human progress. In this story, civilization began approximately 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and has been advancing steadily ever since. Each generation builds upon the achievements of its predecessors. Technology improves. Knowledge accumulates. The arrow of history points ever upward, from primitive caves to modern skyscrapers, from stone tools to silicon chips. We stand at the pinnacle of this ascent, the most advanced humans who have ever lived, looking back at our ancestors with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. But what if this story is incomplete? What if human history is not a straight line, but a cycle? Civilizations rising and falling like waves against a shore, each one's achievements largely erased before the next begins its climb. What if we are not the first to reach for the stars, merely the latest in a sequence whose earlier members have been forgotten? This is not pessimism. It is pattern recognition applied to a longer timescale than we typically consider. Civilizations throughout recorded history have collapsed. Rome fell. The Maya abandoned their cities. The Bronze Age ended in catastrophic systems failure across the eastern Mediterranean. These collapses occurred within the brief window of recorded history. Extend the timeline to 12,000 years, and the possibility of earlier cycles becomes not speculation, but probability. The builders of the pyramids, whoever they were, seem to have understood something we are only beginning to grasp. Individual human lives are brief. Civilizations are mortal. The knowledge that makes complex society possible can be lost within generations if catastrophe disrupts transmission. Wisdom that took centuries to accumulate can vanish in years. We face our own vulnerabilities. Climate change threatens disruptions to agriculture and population distribution. Asteroid impacts remain possible. Nuclear arsenals maintain the capacity to end civilization within hours. Pandemics, as recent experience demonstrates, can emerge suddenly and spread globally before defenses can be organized. We are not immune to the forces that have ended previous human achievements. Perhaps the ancients knew this. Perhaps the impulse that built the pyramids was the same impulse that created the Voyager Golden Record, now carrying human knowledge toward interstellar space. The same impulse that built the Long Now Foundation's 10,000-year clock, designed to keep time across epochs. The same impulse that established the Svalbard Seed Vault, preserving agricultural diversity against future catastrophe. We are attempting what they may have attempted, sending messages to survivors of disasters. We hope will never come, but fear are inevitable. The pyramids may be monuments to exactly this kind of thinking. Artifacts from a civilization that saw destruction approaching and built to ensure that something would remain. If so, they succeeded. Their message has survived. We simply have not yet fully understood what they were trying to tell us. What we do with that message, what we learn from their example, may determine whether our own civilization joins them in the silence of the lost or breaks the cycle they could not escape. We have traveled far together through the hours of this night, from the moonlit stones of Giza to the rain-carved walls of the Sphinx enclosure. From the mathematical precision of the Great Pyramid to the mysterious pillars of Göbekli Tepe. From the megalithic walls of Peru to the silent moai of Easter Island. We have examined evidence and weighed theories. We have listened to what the ancients said about themselves and considered what modern science has revealed. And now, at the end of this journey, we must acknowledge a truth that may be the most important thing we have learned. We do not know. We do not know whether the pyramids were built by a civilization older than the pharaohs. We do not know whether the Sphinx remembers rains that fell before the Sahara became a desert. We do not know whether survivors of a lost age scattered across the world carrying fragments of wisdom they could not bear to let die. The evidence suggests. The patterns hint. The questions persist. But certainty remains beyond our reach, perhaps forever. This uncertainty is not a failure. It is the most honest position available to minds confronting mysteries that have outlasted empires. For generations, textbooks presented the orthodox timeline as settled fact, questions answered, case closed. That confidence was always misplaced. The pyramids did not become less mysterious because scholars stopped admitting their confusion. The anomalies did not disappear because institutions chose to ignore them. All that false certainty accomplished was to delay the reckoning with how much remains unknown. Doubt has crept back in now. Geologists question erosion patterns. Physicists discover hidden chambers. Archaeologists unearth sites that predate every timeline they were taught. The boundaries of the possible expand with each passing decade. Perhaps this is progress, not toward a new certainty that replaces the old, but toward a more humble relationship with the depths of time. The greatest scientists have always understood that their conclusions were provisional, the best explanations available until better evidence emerged. The greatest historians have always known that the past is a foreign country whose language we translate imperfectly, whose customs we interpret through the distorting lens of our own assumptions. Humility before mystery is not ignorance. It is wisdom wearing its truest face. Tonight, let yourself rest in not knowing. Let the questions remain open, suspended in the darkness, like stars whose light left them thousands of years ago. There is freedom in uncertainty, space to wonder without the obligation to conclude. The pyramids will still be standing tomorrow. The mysteries will still be waiting. Nothing requires resolution in this moment except your own breathing, your own settling into stillness. The questions are enough. They have always been enough. They will remain long after we are gone, waiting for minds not yet born to take up the search we cannot complete. The mystery does not belong to scholars alone. It belongs to anyone willing to look, to question, to refuse easy answers when the evidence demands something more. The investigation into our true past is not closed. It is barely beginning, and there is room for every curious mind who wishes to participate. New technologies reveal what previous generations could not see. LiDAR surveys penetrate jungle canopies to map structures hidden beneath vegetation for centuries. Ground-penetrating radar identifies anomalies beneath desert sands that excavation has not yet explored. DNA analysis rewrites our understanding of ancient populations, tracing migrations and connections that no written record preserves. Satellite imagery detects patterns invisible from the ground. Each year brings tools that did not exist the year before, applied to questions that have waited millennia for someone capable of asking them properly. The next breakthrough might come from an established researcher with access to advanced equipment. It might equally come from an amateur with fresh eyes, someone unburdened by assumptions that have calcified into orthodoxy, who notices what professionals have trained themselves not to see. Discovery does not require credentials. It requires attention, persistence, and the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads. The submerged coastlines of the Mediterranean and South Asia remained largely unexplored. The chamber detected within the Great Pyramid has never been entered. The deeper layers of Göbekli Tepe await excavation. Ground-penetrating radar anomalies beneath the Sphinx remain unmapped. Any of these might yield the evidence that transforms speculation into knowledge, that answers questions we have been asking since Napoleon's scholars first measured the pyramids and found numbers that should not exist. You can be part of this search. Read the researchers whose work we have discussed. Follow the investigations as they develop. Support the institutions that fund exploration and question the ones that obstruct it. Talk about these mysteries with others who share your curiosity. The conversation matters. The questions matter. The refusal to accept premature closure matters. Maybe not tonight. Tonight is for rest, for letting the mind settle like sediment after stirring. But tomorrow, or the day after, when the questions return as they always do, know that paths exist for pursuing them. Know that you are not alone in wondering. Know that across the world, in libraries and laboratories and living rooms. Others are staring at the same evidence and feeling the same mixture of frustration and wonder that has accompanied this mystery since the first traveler stood before the pyramids and asked who really built them. The stones have waited this long. They will wait for you. And perhaps, somewhere in their patient silence, they are waiting to tell us something we have not yet learnt to hear. Return now to the Giza Plateau, not with your body, which rests where you have placed it, but with your mind, which has travelled farther tonight than feet could carry it. The hour is late in Egypt too. The tourists have long since departed. The vendors have closed their stalls. The guards have settled into their positions, watching over stones that have been watched for thousands of years. The desert is cold. The wind moves softly across the sand. Above the pyramids, stars burn in patterns that human eyes have traced since consciousness first looked upward and wondered what it meant to exist beneath such vastness. The same stars, the same patterns, the same questions. Somewhere in the darkness, the Sphinx waits. Its face, worn by ages we may never accurately count, gazes toward the eastern horizon where the sun will rise as it has risen for millions of mornings. The builders who carved its body from living rock are gone. Their names have been lost. Their language has fallen silent. But their work remains patient and enduring, keeping watch over secrets it will never willingly surrender. The pyramids catch the faint light of the setting moon. Their angles are precise. Their proportions are deliberate. Every measurement carries meaning that we are still learning to read. Whoever designed them thought in timescales that dwarf ordinary human concerns. They built not for themselves, but for descendants they would never meet, across centuries they would never see. They wanted to be remembered. And here, all these millennia later, we remember them. We do not know their names. We are not certain of their dates. We cannot speak their tongue or sing their songs or understand the prayers they offered to gods whose faces time has worn away. But we know they lived. We know they labored. We know they raised their eyes to these same stars and wondered, as we wonder, about the beginning and the end and the meaning of the brief light between. The questions are the same questions. The mystery is the same mystery. Something connects us across the gulf of ages, a thread of wonder that neither time nor catastrophe has managed to sever. They built in stone so that something would survive. Something has sleep come now. Let the questions settle into the quiet place where dreams are made. Perhaps tonight you will walk through chambers no living person has entered. Perhaps you will hear voices speaking languages that have been silent since the flood. Perhaps the builders themselves will find you in that space between waking and sleeping, where time moves differently and the dead are not entirely gone. Rest well. The pyramids will be there when you wake. The mysteries will be waiting. And somewhere in the space between the stars, those who built these monuments are still watching.